Senator Slotkin asked the defense secretary 4 times if he ordered lethal force against protesters. He never said no. She served. That matters here. Senator Alyssa Slotkin is not a politician asking military questions from a distance. She is an Army veteran who spent years alongside the military, including multiple tours in Iraq before entering Congress, then served on the House Armed Services Committee, then moved to the Senate. She has spent more of her professional life around military institutions than most of the people in that hearing room. She understands chain of command. She understands orders. She understands the institutional culture that makes the question she was about to ask not a political attack, but a foundational accountability demand. What did you tell them to do? She asked 4 times. He never said no. The asymmetry of that exchange is the hearing's central document. A former intelligence officer, an Army veteran, asking a specific yes or no question about military orders in front of cameras on the record. A defense secretary who had been in his role for several months, who had already deployed 4,700 troops to an American city, who sat with his staff behind him and his prepared materials in front of him. She asked 4 times. She told him she wanted the answer to be no. He did not provide it. That is the record. Pete Hegseth sat at the witness table across from a woman who had spent her career around the military he now leads. He had been the defense secretary for several months. In those months, 4,700 troops had been deployed to Los Angeles, the first time since 1965 that Guard troops had been deployed without the permission of a state's governor. California's governor had not authorized the deployment. The federal government had sent armed military forces into a state over the objection of its elected executive. Slotkin had stated her concern at Hegseth's confirmation hearing. She said then that her biggest worry was the potential use of the military in ways that contradict the Constitution or that taint what she described as an apolitical military. That concern was not theoretical when she raised it. It was not theoretical when she returned to the hearing table months later with 4,700 troops already deployed, with a governor already overruled, with a precedent already set. She opened not with a question, with a statement, a documented record of what had already happened and why it mattered. This channel tracks the documentation as it moves through the legal system. If you want to follow where this goes, subscribe and turn on notifications. New videos drop when the record produces something worth documenting. Let's start with the deployment itself. 4,700 troops. Los Angeles, deployed without the governor's consent. The last time the federal government deployed Guard troops to a state without that state's governor's permission was 1965. That deployment occurred during the Selma to Montgomery voting rights marches, a specific and historically charged set of circumstances in which the federal government intervened to protect civil rights marchers facing violent suppression by state and local authorities. The precedent set in 1965 involved federal military protection of citizens whose constitutional rights were being violated by the state, not federal military deployment over a governor's objection to manage protest activity the federal executive found politically inconvenient. The distinction matters because the legal and moral justification for overriding a governor's authority in 1965 was the protection of constitutional rights against state violence. The justification for the Los Angeles deployment was different in character. Slotkin's reference to 1965 was not accidental. She was establishing that the precedent being set involved a different relationship between federal military power and state authority than the one the precedent had been built on. The constitutional framework governing the relationship between the federal government and the states on military deployment is not ambiguous. The Posse Comitatus Act restricts the use of federal military forces for domestic law enforcement. The Insurrection Act provides a mechanism for the president to override that restriction under specific circumstances. Whether those circumstances were met in Los Angeles, whether the legal threshold for deploying troops against the governor's explicit objection was satisfied, is a question of constitutional law that the hearing was not designed to resolve in full. What Slotkin was asking about was simpler and more specific. She was asking about orders, not legal frameworks, not policy justifications. Orders. What did the Secretary of Defense instruct 4,700 troops to do? What authority did they have over American citizens exercising their constitutional right to protest? What were the limits of that authority? And had any order been given that would allow those troops to use lethal force? The distinction between a legal argument and an order question is important because it changes what kind of answer is being demanded. Hegseth is not a court. He is not being asked to rule on the constitutionality of the deployment. He is being asked to describe, as the civilian head of the military, in his capacity as the person who gives orders to those troops, what he told them to do. That is an administrative question. It is the most basic form of congressional oversight. What did you order? A defense secretary who cannot answer that question in a congressional hearing has either not issued clear orders, which is its own problem, or has issued orders he is not prepared to defend in public. Either way, the failure to answer is a document. The first question, detention and arrest. Slotkin asked directly, have you authorized the uniformed military to detain or arrest protesters in Los Angeles? Hegseth said he would start by distinguishing between protesters and people throwing concrete. He said anyone throwing concrete should be arrested. Slotkin said she understood the distinction. She was not asking about people committing crimes. She was asking about protesters. The question was specific. The word was uniformed military, not law enforcement, not federal agents, the uniformed military, troops, soldiers, people whose institutional function is combat, not criminal justice. Hegseth said it was a yes or no thing. She said, yes, it is. She asked again. He said the troops are given very clear orders. She said, what is the order listed out for us? Be a man listed out. That phrase, be a man listed out, from a female Army veteran to the male Secretary of Defense in a federal hearing room, is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a specific statement about what accountability looks like from someone who spent her career in institutions where orders have to be named, where authority has to be documented, where I'd rather not say is not an acceptable answer when lives and constitutional rights are at stake. Hegseth said all orders and what troops are sent there to do are public. If the orders are public, she said, say them right now in this room on this record. Slotkin said, then say it, yes or no. He said they are there to protect law enforcement. That answer is not a yes and it is not a no. It is a characterization of purpose. Law enforcement protection is a mission description. It does not answer whether the troops have the authority to detain or arrest American citizens who are exercising their right to protest peacefully. A soldier protecting law enforcement can, under specific circumstances, have different levels of authority over bystanders, protesters, and individuals in the vicinity than a soldier operating independently. The question Slotkin was asking went to that authority specifically, and Hegseth's answer about protecting law enforcement did not address it. He then said, as we've stated, if necessary, in their own self-defense, they could temporarily detain and hand over to ICE. There it is, not a full answer, not a yes. But the phrase temporarily detain, combined with the ICE handover mechanism, establishes that the uniformed military has been given authority to take physical custody of American persons. People who may be protesters, may be bystanders, may be American citizens with no criminal record, and transfer them to immigration enforcement. The legal and constitutional weight of that phrase is significant. The Posse Comitatus Act, enacted in 1878, in the aftermath of Reconstruction, was a direct response to the use of federal troops for domestic enforcement during the military occupation of the South. Congress passed it to prevent the president from using the standing army as a domestic police force, a power the founders had specifically feared and the colonial experience with British military occupation had specifically demonstrated the dangers of. The law restricts federal military forces from performing law enforcement functions on American soil. It does not include a carve-out for temporary detentions handed off to ICE. The statutory framework for military involvement in domestic situations does not clearly authorize troops to take civilians into custody based on their proximity to a protest. Whether the legal justification for temporarily detain and hand over to ICE has been documented, reviewed by military legal counsel, and provided to Congress as part of the record that the hearing did not produce. Hegseth said the orders are public. He did not produce them. Slotkin said, say it. He said temporarily detain. The legal question embedded in that phrase is documentable. The Posse Comitatus Act restricts federal military forces from performing law enforcement functions. Courts have interpreted that restriction to include arrest and detention of civilians. The exception framework through the Insurrection Act provides a mechanism for overriding those restrictions, but the Insurrection Act requires a specific presidential proclamation. Whether that proclamation was issued, whether military lawyers reviewed the detention authority being claimed, whether the temporary detained formulation has a documented legal basis in the orders given to those 4,700 troops, those are questions that Slotkin was pressing Hegseth to answer. His answer was that the orders are public. The orders were not produced. Slotkin recorded it. The record is in the transcript. The second question, cyber tools. Have you authorized U.S. military cyber tools to investigate people participating in these protests? Hegseth said, certainly in no way that I'd be aware of. That answer requires specific attention, not no, not we have not done that. Certainly in no way that I'd be aware of. The Secretary of Defense of the United States was asked whether the military's cyber capabilities had been turned toward American citizens exercising their right to protest. His answer was not a denial, it was a statement of personal ignorance. In the structure of military command, the Secretary of Defense is the civilian head of the entire apparatus. If military cyber tools were being used against American protesters, the Secretary of Defense bears institutional responsibility for that use, regardless of whether he personally authorized each individual operation. Certainly in no way that I'd be aware of is not a guarantee that it hasn't happened. It is a statement that if it happened, he didn't know about it. That is a different and significantly more limited assurance. Slotkin said, okay, that's good, I love that answer. Not no, not we haven't done that. Certainly in no way that I'd be aware of. 2 questions, 2 non-answers, 1 question left. The tone of that response from a former intelligence professional who knows exactly what the limitations of that answer mean is the tone of someone who has just heard a witness accidentally reveal more than they intended to. Slotkin has a background in intelligence. She has spent time in environments where the distinction between what a senior official authorized, what happened without their explicit authorization, and what happened outside their awareness is a functional distinction with legal and institutional significance. Certainly in no way that I'd be aware of does not mean no, it means if it happened, I wasn't told. For the Secretary of Defense to be unaware of whether military cyber capabilities were being used against American protesters is itself a statement about the institutional controls governing those capabilities under his leadership. The third question, lethal force. Have you given the order for the uniformed military to use lethal force against unarmed protesters? Hegseth laughed. He asked what evidence she had that such an order had ever been given. She provided it immediately. The evidence is Secretary Esper. Mark Esper was Donald Trump's own Secretary of Defense, a Republican, a Trump appointment, a member of the same administration that Hegseth now serves. In 2020, Trump gave Esper an order. The order was to deploy active-duty military against protesters in American cities and, in Esper's account, to shoot at their legs. Esper refused. He wrote about it in his book. He described the order he received and the fact that he declined to execute it. This is not hearsay. This is a published memoir by a former cabinet secretary of the same political party as the president currently in office. The order exists in the documented record. It was given to a Republican Secretary of Defense who was asked by a Republican president to shoot American protesters in the legs. That Secretary of Defense said no. He wrote it down. He described the order, the context in which it was given, his refusal, and his reasoning for the refusal. The book is publicly available. The account has not been disputed by the president who allegedly gave the order. The significance of the Esper reference is not partisan. Slotkin was not citing a political opponent or a hostile witness. She was citing Trump's own Secretary of Defense, a Republican, a Trump appointment, a person who served in the same administration that Hegseth now serves. When that person documented a presidential order to use the military against protesters and described refusing to execute it because he knew in his gut it wasn't right, he provided the historical baseline against which Hegseth's current behavior can be measured. Slotkin told Hegseth he had more guts and balls than you, because he said, "I'm not going to send in the uniformed military to do something that I know in my gut isn't right." Then she asked for the fourth time, "Have you given the order that they can use lethal force against unarmed protesters?" She said, "I want the answer to be no. Please tell me it's no." Those two sentences are worth sitting with. They are not an attack. They are not a trap. They are a direct statement of what she wanted the hearing to produce. A documented, on-the-record denial from the Secretary of Defense that American soldiers had been authorized to kill American protesters. She told him what she wanted. She told him the answer she was hoping for. She asked him to provide it. Hegseth did not say no. He said she should be careful what she reads in books. Then he added, "except for the Bible." That response, in the context of a question about whether the Secretary of Defense has authorized the use of lethal force against Americans exercising their constitutional rights, is the record the hearing produced, not a denial, not a description of the orders in place. A deflection to biblical reading standards in response to a former Army veteran who had just cited a published memoir by a Republican former defense secretary as documented evidence of a presidential order to shoot protesters in the legs. 4 times, one question. The answer she wanted to hear, the answer that would have established that the Secretary of Defense has not authorized the use of lethal force against American citizens exercising their constitutional rights, was available to him. It is one word, no. It takes less than a second to say. It would have ended the exchange. It would have resolved the question. It would have provided the documentation that the hearing was designed to produce. He did not say it. 4 questions asked, 1 word available, 1 word not said. Let's examine what that silence means. The apolitical military argument is the center of everything Slotkin was pressing on. She was not making a partisan argument. She was making a constitutional one, the kind that an Army veteran makes when she watches the institution she served get deployed against citizens exercising constitutional rights. The founders who built the framework for civilian control of the military understood the temptation to use force against domestic dissent. The Posse Comitatus Act codified the principle that military power and domestic law enforcement must remain separate. That principle is not a technicality. It is the line between a democracy and something else. Slotkin's concern was not with the soldiers in Los Angeles. They follow orders. Her concern was with the orders and with the defense secretary who in a congressional hearing could not or would not describe what those orders contained. When he cannot say whether lethal force was authorized, when he answers a cyber surveillance question with certainly not in any way I'd be aware of, the non-answer is itself a statement about where the line has moved. The Esper comparison is the sharpest version of that argument. Esper was a Republican. He was Trump's choice. He understood military authority and presidential power. When Trump asked him to turn the military against protesters, Esper refused, not because he was a political opponent of the president, but because he understood what the order would mean for the institution he was asked to execute it through. He protected the military from an order that would have damaged it. Hegseth, when presented with that comparison, deflected to a joke about the Bible. The gap between those two responses, Esper's refusal documented in a book, Hegseth's inability to say no documented in a transcript, is the document this hearing produced. Then Slotkin moved to Iran. The lethal force question had produced a Bible joke. The troops were still in Los Angeles. She moved to the next theater. The troops were still deployed. The orders were still undescribed. Have you commissioned any day after planning, any force protection, any use of ground troops in Iran, any cost assessments? The question was not about whether America could execute a military operation against Iran. It was about whether the Pentagon was thinking beyond the attack to what follows. The Iraq War began with a military campaign that achieved its initial objective, the removal of Saddam Hussein's government, within weeks. The Pentagon's planning for what came next was inadequate by the documented assessment of multiple official reviews. The resulting occupation lasted years, cost thousands of American lives, destabilized the region, and produced consequences that military planners, by their own subsequent admission, had not adequately modeled. Afghanistan followed a similar arc: rapid initial military success, inadequate day-after planning, a 2-decade engagement that ended with a withdrawal widely described as a strategic failure. The bipartisan consensus on both wars, established in the years after, is that the military planning for the day after, the occupation, the governance transition, the cost in blood and resources, had not been proportionate to the planning for the initial strike. Slotkin was asking whether the Pentagon had learned from that pattern, whether, before any military action against Iran, the Defense Secretary had commissioned the kind of planning that could document what happens after the bombs stop falling. She asked specifically about cost assessments, force protection, ground troop scenarios, the questions that the Iraq and Afghanistan postmortems identified as having been insufficiently addressed before those wars began. Hegseth said, "We have plans for everything." That answer, "we have plans for everything," confirms that planning exists without specifying what it contains. Whether day-after scenarios have been modeled at the scale the historical record suggests they require, or whether the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan have been incorporated into the planning framework for a potential Iran operation, that answer, "we have plans for everything," is the same category of non-answer as everything else that preceded it. It confirms that planning exists without confirming what the planning contains, who authorized it, what its scope is, or whether the specific category of day-after planning she was asking about has received the attention that the historical record of similar conflicts suggests it requires. Outside the hearing room, Trump was talking to reporters about Iran. He said they win regardless. He said the Iranian Navy was defeated. He said 158 ships were sunk. He said the Iranian leaders are all dead. He said, "We've defeated their military, their air force, their anti-aircraft, their radar, their leaders." He described tankers loaded with oil and gas coming toward the United States as a beautiful thing to see. The contrast between those statements in the hearing inside is the contrast between a commander-in-chief narrating a concluded military operation in confident declarative terms, defeated, sunk, dead, won, and a defense secretary who in that same period was unable to provide a single yes or no answer about the orders given to domestic troops operating in an American city. Outside, "We win regardless, their leaders are all dead. 158 ships." Inside, certainly in no way that I'd be aware of. They're there to protect law enforcement. I'd be careful what you read in books. Both conversations were happening in Washington on the same day. The troops in Los Angeles were still deployed. The governor of California still had not authorized their presence. The question of what orders they were operating under was still unanswered. The question of whether lethal force had been authorized had been asked 4 times by an Army veteran who said she wanted the answer to be no. 4 times, the same question. "I want the answer to be no. Please tell me it's no." He didn't say no, and the troops were still there. The deployment that was described as temporary had not ended. The governor who had not authorized it had not been able to compel its end. The constitutional question of whether the federal government can override a governor's objection to guard deployment in this context had not been resolved by any court. The orders under which 4,700 troops were operating in an American city had not been produced to the Congressional Committee exercising oversight of the Defense Department. Slotkin had asked for the orders 4 times in 4 different formulations. She had asked about detention. She had asked about cyber tools. She had asked about lethal force. She had invoked the documented record of a Republican predecessor who had been given a similar order and refused it. She had said, "Please tell me no." That is the documented record. The orders are not public. One senator asked 4 times, still no answer.